Geraldine Jamieson on Manx Radio.
Well, hello, and a very warm welcome indeed to this week's programme. Actually, it's nice to be back with you again, refreshed after a very pleasant summer break. Well, now, it is just over 2 weeks ago when the vast majority of the Western world had to face this most awful of anniversaries. When, on the 11th of September last year, the hijacked plane struck the Twin Towers, downtown Manhattan, New York, with, of course, the most appalling, utterly devastating consequences. One of my guests on my programme at the time was New Yorker Cherry Robbins, whom I caught up with once more on a recent quick visit back to her island home here in Peel. Well, Cherry, welcome. It's good to talk with you, I must say again, and especially we are talking actually on the eve of this first anniversary. Remind us all, Cherry, where you were exactly and what you were doing on that fateful morning.
Well, as usual, I was headed out to work, and as I got to the front door, the doorman said to me, "A plane has hit the World Trade Center." And I looked at him, and he said, "And we've just heard another plane has hit, so we know it's terrorism." Well, I don't know if you remember, but about 20 years ago, a plane hit the Empire State Building. It hit it during fog. And the most that happened were maybe there were 8 deaths. There was maybe 2 or 3 floors. So this is all I began to accept in my thinking. So I trotted on out, and I caught my bus, and I went to work. Where I get off is 42nd Street and 5th Avenue. And when I reached that point, I realized something really a bit bigger had happened. The streets were full of people, as if they had just emptied out from all the buildings onto the sidewalks, and there was not a sound. It was absolutely eerie. And they were looking down 5th Avenue at this enormous black cloud of smoke that was floating over the base of the city. And I thought, what am I doing here? What have I done? What is happening? I got to the store, went through our security, which has always been very good. And as soon as I got through security, they said to me, "The store's closed, you can't leave." So I said...
Just like that?
Just like that, yes. And I sort of, it shook me a little bit. And they said, "You're to go to your department and report to your manager." I realized in retrospect that the reason they didn't want us to leave, they had no idea what was happening. They didn't know if we were being bombed, if there were other planes in the air. And the biggest problem was that most of the people who work in the store use underground transportation. And they didn't know what of the underground transportation was working and what wasn't. So we all gathered. And I do remember my manager saying, "Oh, Bush is going to go back at them big time, big time." That's all she kept saying, "Big time. We're going to go back at them big time." She's a little tiny lady, big time, my foot.
I wonder who she thought they were at this time.
Nobody knew. We knew it was a terrorist attack, but we didn't know, we pretty much guessed, but, we've thought before that it was the Islamics and it was our own people. So, who knew? But this, it looked pretty much as if it was a terrorist attack. So I finally said to her, I tried to reach my children, and I couldn't get through on the telephone. And I went up to her and I said, "I'd like to go home. I can walk. I don't have to take public transportation. It's a few blocks. I can walk." She said, "Aren't you afraid?" And I said, "Of what? I'm not afraid. I've lived through an awful lot of things in my life, and I want to go home." So she said, "Okay, but you have to sign out so we know exactly where you are." Well, I did catch a bus, which stopped for me. It was absolutely loaded. And when I got on, he refused to take my token or my payment. He said, "I am not taking my regular route. I'm only stopping if someone wants off, not wants on." And I got on because somebody wanted off, so you don't have to pay. I thought, that's a plus. Mm-hmm. And then there were 2 ladies, and they were discussing the fact that the World Trade Center had collapsed. And I said to myself, it's a big rumor. I won't accept that. It couldn't possibly happen. I'm not listening. I am not listening to that. I got off at my stop, although he had to take another road. The roads were clogged with people walking and driving to get out of the city. Everything is going north. I found out later they walked over the George Washington Bridge. They walked over the 59th Street Bridge. All of these bridges were normally for cars or buses. People were walking out of the city because they didn't know how they could get home. I get home, and my phone rings, and it's you from the Isle of Man. I couldn't reach my children who lived in Providence and who lived in San Francisco. But Geraldine got through on my line from the Isle of Man.
And you were a great wow, I have to say, on the program. It was so topical, of course.
Well, it was very fresh at that point.
It was very fresh at that point, and we had you from New York, down, literally downtown Manhattan, and also Don Quayle, who was the former president of the North American Manx Association, and he was situated in Washington, so he could tell us about the experience of Flight 93 in Pennsylvania, and of course the Pentagon. So that was all very well. When you got home, there was a lovely little story here. I do remember, I'm sure you won't mind reiterating it for us, Cherry, about your neighbour next door. People were desperate actually to fly the flag.
He came over, he said, I've got to have a flag. I've got to have an American flag. Have you got one? I said, yes, and it's on the Isle of Man, where I fly it every July 4th and 5th. But it was a desperation. Everyone wanted to make a statement. We are Americans, and we're going to handle this. And we want you to know we're very proud of how we're going to handle it. I don't think anybody had a clue of what was going to be from this, because nothing like this had ever happened.
And of course, the enormity of it meant that there were probably precious few people throughout the States, really, that didn't at least know somebody whose, child, son, brother, father, somebody or other, had been caught up in it.
That's right. My granddaughter at school, 3 or 4 of her classmates had lost not maybe one parent, 2 parents. Both parents had worked in the World Trade Center. It affected everybody immediately that way. I have to tell you, the saddest thing to me that I saw on that day were the disaster crews from the hospitals waiting to take in the people that were hurt that never appeared. There were so few. The people that got out. And they were in such a state of being so stunned, they just ran. They left. People who could walk left. The people who couldn't, there were some. There were many casualties. But they expected thousands of casualties, and there weren't. And they were all standing there, and people were giving blood. There was nobody to help. There was nobody to give blood to. That, to me, was shattering. I mean, that was awful.
Well, you
awful.
needed to actually all hone in to a leader, to somebody who could actually hold the country together. And you would have thought it would have been the president, but he was running around for several hours in Air Force One.
Well, he was being hidden. He was being put down into this place because nobody really knew.
Giuliani, the mayor of New York,
What
really took over.
He was unbelievable. That man, striding around as people were running away from the dust, he was walking into the dust. And he was saying, because all the disaster equipment that the city of New York had laid out in a room 2 or 3 times the size of this with these big pieces of equipment for a disaster had all gone. They were wiped out. The heads of the Port Authority, the head of the fire department,
they were all situated in the World Trade Center.
That's right. And they were no longer. They weren't there. And this man stood literally like a giant and pulled everyone together because he was not rattled. He was straight. He was right to the point. And he said, listen, there's nothing we can't do. My little fire station, 2 blocks from my house, had 22 people on the roster. 11 were killed that day. And it was that way with all the fire departments. The fire department was just ruined. It was just completely ruined.
I mean, the saddest thing to me, just watching, of course, all those thousands of miles the other side of the big pond, was that all those brave firemen, I mean, you are brave by even enrolling as a fireman, but they were actually walking up
into
those
Yes.
steps and
Yes.
stairs to save
Yes.
other people. They were walking to their deaths.
Absolutely. And the thing that I kept thinking was, how are they going to put the fire out that high up? How are they going to get up there to do anything? How can they put it out? I mean, it was a monster fire.
And that people would choose, would actually
Yes.
jump to their death rather
Well,
than be burnt alive.
You know, I've thought a lot about that. And I have wondered whether maybe they weren't pushed out by the blast. If maybe that blast was so enormous, I don't think we'll ever really know. But I do feel you're probably right. One or two probably thought that the fire was just so monstrous, anything was better than to be burned that way. Anybody above where the planes hit, they were finished. I mean, there was no way out for them because they couldn't get down. Below, they did get out. A lot of people got out. And it was hard to figure how many because so many of them kept going. Yeah. They didn't stop and say, this is my name and I was on such and such a floor. They just left and they went. So it took us a long time to know what the actual figures were. There were an enormous amount of foreigners, and it took a long time to trace them, to get all the information. A lot of illegal immigrants who were working in the restaurants who were not listed, and they were afraid, their families were afraid to come forward because they were afraid they would be sent, So there were many, many things, the ripple from that, and it's still going on.
What was it like, take a sort of week after week after week after? I mean, it's a wonder there wasn't actually a revolt, a rebellion, literally, of people just against anybody, that they... It's a wonder that they were able to accept it reasonably well, I thought. I mean, is this down to this one man, Giuliani, do you think? Or
I think he had a lot to do with it, yes. I think his strength of character and his bluntness. He's a very blunt man. And he showed us a side of himself we'd never seen. Compassion. He felt for everybody.
He was just coming to the end of his term as the mayor of New York. And in fact, he wasn't all that terribly popular until
he
now.
had done a lot of things, social service things, that the city was very upset about, that he had been ruthless in many ways. And here was this ruthless man being compassionate and being wonderful and understanding. And if they started down one street and the rubble was rolling across the streets and they couldn't get through it, he said, okay, fellas, we're going this way. And he would lead them down another street. I mean, he marched at the head, and he gathered. As he went, he gathered the strength of the city to work with him. And he did it. He did it. He was remarkable.
Now, another extraordinary thing, of course, is although Americans are known, for their generosity, and of course there is vast wealth in the United States of America as well, but the amounts of money that came in...
Staggering. First of all, you have to
realize...
For charities, the difference between charity monies and government monies. The government monies goes for compensation. Charity money goes for assistance. And charity money is much more flexible, covers many more people, can do much more than government money can do. To give you an idea, the Red Cross raised less than 2 months, $900 million. This is about, I would say, maybe 600 or 700 million pounds. I can't fathom it. Maybe you can. The United Way raised $500 million.
Now, they're an overall umbrella, charitable umbrella.
Yes, that's the United Way. Red Cross is all over the country, and there was a lot of controversy about that. You see, the Red Cross houses...
Well, the Red Cross, of course, is global.
Global, but it houses, feeds, and clothes anybody through any disaster. And yet this money came for the World Trade disaster. And people were saying, I want my money used for the World Trade disaster. Don't use it for Iowa with a drought or Indiana with a flood. I don't want... And yet the Red Cross is set up to do just that. The New York Times raised $50 million. The New York Times, with a fund, a 9/11 fund. There are a lot of nonprofit groups that always benefited from gifts had to go out of business.
Well, this United Way, it's not something that we are familiar with, I must say, in the British Isles, I don't think. Surely this is where they would come in, as this overall umbrella and sort of say, well, let's all pool together, folks,
right.
and find the needy causes.
Yes, which they tried. Now, they have finally, but in the first place, they had to handle all this money. They were never equipped to handle this kind of money. And once they were able to, tell people, yes, we got your money. I mean, the $900 million came from probably 700 million people, whereas normally they get 100,000 from this company and 200,000 from that company. This was person
Individual
by
people.
person who felt they wanted to help. Now, Giuliani reached the whole country. I know in weeks after, I work at Lord & Taylor's and I sell jewelry. We would get these lovely ladies who would come in that you could tell they came from outside of New York, and they'd have big buttons on saying, Iowa loves New York, or Idaho loves New York. And I would thank them for coming, and they'd say, Giuliani told us to come, we came. He got on the television and he said, come, the city is safe, we need you, come and spend your money. And that's what they did.
Now, Chinatown is very close, of
yes.
course.
Anything
and thereby
that was
hangs
close.
the tale.
Oh, yes. Chinatown was around, Soho is around, all of lower Manhattan was literally closed off for a full month. You had let's say you have a coffee bar, and every morning you served between 200 and 300 cups of coffee. Suddenly, you weren't serving any, but you had all the coffee beans were there and everything to go with it. You were closed. Could you survive? Probably not. Those were the small businesses. Chinatown, I went down to Chinatown about 5 weeks, 4 to 5 weeks after the disaster. I have a very close friend who lost her son, and there was a memorial service. Of course, there was no body. That, I think, is the worst, for so many people. There was no... they're still finding body parts in some of the apartments that are now able to be re-inhabited. When they go in and they're cleaning off dust and things, they're finding body parts, and they're blocks and blocks away from where it happened. It is just horrendous to think of the human suffering. But when I got down to Chinatown, I was able to go in the subway, but where I got off was completely different when I have ever gotten off before. And as I wandered around, it was a ghost town. Whole streets were blocked off going into parts, other parts of downtown. Shuck, who was the father of this man, was the liaison between Chinatown and the police department. And the police department had simply closed off the street where the services were held between the church and the small shop. And the outpouring of love and of people just pouring in to tell, to mourn with them.
To support.
But
there was a young widow and young children, of course.
Yes. And when I said I wanted to do something, the son-in-law, my friend's son-in-law, said, Cherry, send money. Just send money. And I am talking of a very well-placed family with resources, with other things. But here was this woman, she has to buy food, and everything suddenly stopped. Banks couldn't give money downtown because they didn't know what they had. They didn't know. It was just unbelievable. It is now leveling out. These enormous charities, I think the government has finally decided how much to give to the actual victims. $2 million apiece. $2 million. It is the first time in the history of our city that a massive man-made disaster has affected the rich. Usually a disaster affects the poor.
But wasn't that Osama bin Laden's, of course,
that's right.
point?
This is what he
wanted to do. The decadent, materialistic United States of America.
And how do you deal with this? How do you say to a woman whose husband was making $500,000 a year and whose potential in his lifetime was millions, I'm only giving you $2 million, She says, no, I don't want that. I want what he would have made. And then you have the busboy, who in his lifetime may have made $15,000 a year. He's being given $20,000 in a lump sum to tide him over because he can't find a job, because there's not, it is causing enormous questioning, enormous upheaval. Everybody has an idea about how to do it and what to do, and nobody's satisfied with anything.
But the whole thing was, of course, as well, the terrible effect on America's psyche, really.
Yes. For the first
The
time,
first
we weren't
time
safe.
you weren't safe.
We weren't safe.
You'd been cocooned, really.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we should have been alerted when they tried to blow up the World Trade Center from the bottom, which didn't work. So they were smart enough to come to the top. We never thought.
I mean, at least Britain in modern times had to cope
Well,
with
you've coped,
IRA
yes.
terrorism,
Yes.
you know, and they've had, you know.
And that was in your streets, your houses.
Oh,
your
yes.
yes.
Canary Wharf. I mean, right
Right
into
there.
Britain. I mean, you can
Right.
take various places, the famous
But we've
Birmingham
never had
bombs and
that
so on.
happen, you know.
But you've never experienced that. Now, do you go, have you been recently, for instance, to Ground Zero? What is it like now?
I have never gone to Ground Zero. I cannot get myself to go. I want to go, but I can't. I've gone back to Chinatown, and Chinatown is alive again. Everybody is back. All the little shops are back. And my friend keeps saying to me, I wish they'd stop talking about it. It's too hard for my mourning. You know, the people mourn in their own ways. But she knew her son was gone, so she had a closure for herself. And she wants to go on. Not everybody does. Some people will never get over it. As a matter of fact, the biggest problem these private people will have is providing mental health services to people who have been shattered, who have no resources mentally, physically, or financially to deal with something this size. Believe me, the rich will recover because they have resources. The bright will recover. They have resources. But it is the poor that will take the brunt of it and take the longest to feel.
Some people, of course, I can quite appreciate your point of view, but for some people, it's almost a necessity for them to be able to go back to the
Right.
spot where
Absolutely.
they lost their loved ones.
Absolutely.
Now, they have they've created a bridge, haven't
Yes, and what they finally did, because there were these hordes of people that were going down, and at times there would be many, many people, other times not. So they put up a procedure in which you could go to many places in the city and get a ticket. Didn't cost you anything. But that ticket said, you can go to Ground Zero on Tuesday, such and such a date, between 2 and 3. You can go to Ground Zero on Wednesday at such and such. In other words, these people it was a reserved time for them. So they broadened out the crowds so that everyone had a chance to walk across the bridge and look down at this terrible hole. You know, we forget the World Trade Center went down, 8, 10 floors into the ground. Mm-hmm. All of that was also destroyed. That telephone lines, gas lines, your phones, your trains, everybody was affected.
The whole infrastructure.
The infrastructure of the city had to be rebuilt.
And all that rubble. I mean, all those
rubble.
floors of
Yes,
huge buildings had to be taken
Had to
somewhere.
be taken away and
sieved.
And it's still being sieved.
For body parts.
It's still being sieved, but they have removed it in less than a year, which I don't think any other country could have done.
Great credit.
The response. There was a lot of volunteer workers, not only in working, but who fed them, who gave them a place to rest. Tremendous outgrowth of love and really attention.
What are they going to do in the way of a memorial? Have they decided that yet?
No.
I mean, what are they going to do with this huge space, really?
They haven't decided. They've sent out and received a lot of ideas. They had a whole group presented, and nobody liked them. But you know, as everybody says, a camel was decided by a committee. That's why it has 2 humps. But that's what you're going to have to deal with. Everybody putting their 2 cents worth in. And eventually, I think they'll come up with something. Won't please everybody.
I was going to say, whoever makes that decision
Won't please
is going to be a very
everybody.
brave person or persons.
Yeah.
And it's the long-term effects, if you've
Yes.
dwelt on there, on the population who will need, as you rightly say, Cherry, this massive mental health program. Now, how would you counter this when people perhaps living, far away from it, like ourselves in Britain, and we're facing, as we speak, you and I speak, this first anniversary, that perhaps it's going over the top a bit?
It is. And yet, I don't think you can stop it from going over the top. In the first place, everybody wants their views expressed and what they do. And you know something? Everyone is free to mourn in their own way. Everybody can take control of how they do it. But the city government, the state government, the country government has to please everybody, and they ain't going to do it, no matter how they try. But they'll do their best.
I'm really looking at it from a point of view, perhaps, and of course, speaking from my side of the table, I could be just as guilty as the rest. But taking the broader, the general term of the media, are they feeding on it too much?
Yes and no. And yet, I believe that the media brought it to the world in a way that nothing else could have brought it to the world. And the world was affected. The amount of foreigners in that building, the amount of foreign businesses that were affected by what happened at that building. So in a way, the media has done a good thing, but it always goes a little too far.
And of course, we've had falling global markets since.
Right.
We've had fraudulent dealings in the highest business echelons. Cans of worms have been opened up in America that have even horrified your president.
That have horrified the people, everybody. And maybe it's time we dealt with it. And we have to deal with it. You know, a lot of people say, well, you brought it on yourselves because of you did this and you did that. And my answer to that is, when you tell a rape victim they brought it on themselves because they wore a short skirt. No. Rape is rape, and terrorism is terrorism. And the other way is talking and learning from each other. I do think it's brought the whole world together, Geraldine. I really think we have all been brought together.
There is always a silver lining, or so they say,
yes.
in whatever clouds we have to face. Will it happen again, Cherry?
We hope not, but let me tell you, they're preparing for it. All of these groups that are having so much trouble doling out the monies, they're looking into themselves to see, how did we handle it? How can we best handle it? What do we do if this happens again? What have we learned from this? And of course, you know, you go to your airports now, it's a little bit different. You go to all around the world, it's a little bit different.
Well, should the leader of the Western world, who undoubtedly is your president, and we, of course, in Britain follow suit,
for which I must say we're very grateful.
To a great degree.
We're very grateful.
But, I mean, should he be so trigger happy? Should we not try to make peace, not further war?
Well, I'm very grateful to Mr. Blair that he got him to go to the United Nations first, to take the first steps, and then you go from there. I don't like the trigger happy. That's what my little manager would say is, big time, big time.
So how do we curb, the dictators and the threatening attitudes of people like Saddam Hussein?
I don't know. If I did, maybe I'd be president.
Well, Cherry, I must say, it's wonderful to be talking to you again. Now, you actually chose to spend this first anniversary away from Ground Zero, from downtown Manhattan, New York, flying across the Atlantic to your idyllic hideaway home here on the island. Was this total escapism or fortuitous coincidence?
It was coincidence. I took the 2 weeks the store told me I could have my vacation. When I discovered it included this, I was very grateful, because I think the city is going to be one giant wake, and I'm not sure if I could have handled that.
Well, your return flight, I note, was the day after the 11th of September, when I'm sure the skies were left to an eerie ghostliness on that particular day. As you've just really answered for us, this travel date selection then was born perhaps out of fear or not really respect to the dead.
No. It was not either. It was just taken because that's when I was given 2 weeks.
Excellent. Well, Cherry Robbins, I'm very obliged to you indeed. Thank you once again for joining me on the Geraldine Jamieson interview this week.
Thank you.